Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for tuning in to this episode of Just Another Tinfoil Hat, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Zelia Edgar. The aim of this show is to discuss all aspects of the paranormal, from the relatively mainstream to the downright bizarre, to pose questions and entertain ideas regarding every angle of the unexplained. So, hang on to your tinfoil hats, keep your hands and feet inside the saucer, and please, enjoy the ride. Tonight, I am very pleased to introduce my guest, author and paranormal investigator Chad Lewis. For over 2 decades, Chad Lewis has traveled the back roads of the world in search of the strange and unusual. From tracking vampires in Transylvania and searching for the elusive monster of Loch Ness, to trailing the dangerous Tata Duende through remote villages of Belize and searching for ghosts in Ireland's castles, Chad has scoured the earth in search of the paranormal. Chad has been featured on the Discovery Channel's A Haunting, William Shatner's Weird or What, ABC's World's Scariest Places, Monsters and Mysteries in America, along with being a frequent contributor to Ripley's Believe It or Not Radio. With a master's degree in psychology, Chad has authored 25 books on the supernatural and extensively lectures on his fascinating findings. The more bizarre the legend is, the more likely you will find Chad there. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Chad Lewis to the show. And seriously, Chad, thank you so much for appearing on this episode. It's kind of surreal since I've pretty much grown up going to your presentations and book signings. You've been a huge influence on my research. So thank you again so much for joining me today.
Well, this is really great for me because my head's full of ice right now as I'm finishing up a book on the Wendigo. So this is a nice little escape back into the normal world, if you will.
Yeah, no kidding. I know I saw that you and Kevin Nelson were just finishing up research on that, and it looked very cool, no pun intended. So,
well, this book, the Wendigo, the legend and lore, is by far the most complex, bizarre, puzzling, and interesting legend I've ever researched. And Kevin and I had started doing this research 15 years ago, and we had planned to do a book back then as well. But over the years, we would stop and do something else, and we thought maybe perhaps the legend was too big, the lore was too sprawling, it couldn't be done. Maybe we weren't the right ones to do it, being Caucasian men in the U.S., when much of the Wendigo legend was a First Nation legend in Canada. So we really put it on hold several different times, and then eventually it couldn't wait anymore. The Wendigo, figuratively had possessed us too.
Well, I noticed that the Wendigo does appear to be making kind of more of an appearance in reports lately. I've been seeing it quite a bit all over the place. Would you say that it's gaining attention, at least in recent years?
It really is. And I think the irony of this is that everyone's looking for a new cryptid or a new monster or a new legend. And for that, they're turning to one of the oldest. And there's been so many papers that have been done by academics looking at the Wendigo in terms of a woman's role in the tribe or the white man's incursion into the northwest part of Canada. But never have they really focused on the legend itself in more of a supernatural term of that this creature was actually real. They don't look at it as though it could have been something that they believed was a flesh and blood monster along with being a spirit. It's more looked at as Wendigo psychosis, a mental illness that we have to look at it as starvation or lack of fur trading, not actually paranormal. So I think that's where we're going to differ quite a bit from what's already out there.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, I know when you do research on the Wendigo, that Wendigo psychosis is one of the first things that pops up. And I've always wondered too exactly like how that plays in, if at all, to the sightings, if there is some sort of connection there, because it's obvious that there is a second way of looking at it, and that is that there is some sort of phenomenon outside of this mental disorder that people actually believed in sightings of some sort of supernatural being. Another thing that is kind of interesting about it is I feel like some people make the connection between the Wendigo and Bigfoot. And I feel like there is a definite difference between the two. Would you say that there is, or are they connected in some ways?
I think the biggest misconception with Wendigo is that it's just some cannibalistic Sasquatch or Bigfoot. And the differences couldn't be more stark. That Bigfoot sightings and a lot of the First Nation Native people and the French missionaries and the fur traders and the explorers, they all had Bigfoot, werewolf, vampire legends they brought with them as well. And most of the sightings of the creature in its creature form, not in its possession of possessing somebody to turn or go Wendigo, they wildly differ from Bigfoot. That this creature, the Wendigo, can be as big as it wants. It could grow 30 feet tall if it wanted. It can swim across the lake above or underwater with never taking a breath. The cold weather never harms it. It's very thin and muscular, and it looks very gaunt. It's missing its mouth usually because it's chewed off its own lips and tongue in its insatiable hunt for human flesh. So it's much different than what you'd consider the Bigfoot, this creature, 8 to 10 feet tall, 400 pounds, walking around. And the Wendigo invoked terror like no other creature in the history of cryptids. If people heard the Wendigo was within 100 miles, they would abandon their village or the tribal grounds until the Wendigo passed, and then they would come back in, just merely on the mention that there was a Wendigo in the area.
Oh, wow. Yeah, and I do feel like Bigfoot, I mean, some encounters, obviously people are afraid of them, but for the most part, they tend to be a lot more positive or at least less negative than the extreme terror you mentioned. Another question I have, because we're both, of course, very familiar with Linda Godfrey's work. Do you think there is any connection to the man-wolf phenomenon and the Wendigo? Because I know the man-wolf is one where, unlike Bigfoot, it does also tend to spark that intense fear in people.
I think one of the biggest similarities is the shape-shifting ability that many cultures believe that the Wendigo could disguise itself in any animal that it wanted, whether it was a bear, a moose, or a wolf, even disguising itself and attacking. There are many accounts of a mysterious black dog coming into the village, and tribesfolk and native people, and along with the pioneers, were terrified that it was the Wendigo in disguise, bringing in hellhound legends and devil dogs. But in terms of the Wendigo being never reported as being hairy, like the wolf man, but it did certainly have shape-shifting abilities. And not only could it shapeshift into any animal or image that it wanted, it could also possess anything from a human to an animal to an infant.
Oh, wow. So this is bringing up a lot of similarities then, at least in my mind, to like the vampire legends of Europe, which of course you studied pretty extensively.
There are a lot of similarities. And of course, that was brought over with the early explorers and the missionaries and fur traders that were there. The Wendigo is and always will be a First Nation legend. It will be tied to the First Nation people forever as their legend, much like vampires are tied to Transylvania. Europe has, werewolves, and people think of Ireland for the fairies and the little people and the like. But also, early on, it was also experienced by so many other cultures, the early pioneers and explorers there. As I said, the missionaries that came in to convert the local people, the fur traders that came from all over the world to ply their trade there. They influenced and were influenced by the legend too. So they brought over stories of vampires and werewolves. In fact, dating back to the mid-1800s, many people believed the only way to kill a Wendigo was by using a silver bullet, obviously brought over from the werewolf tradition. And many skeptics believed that the silver bullet was more of a modern conception by Hollywood, that's how you kill these animals. But we have newspapers dating back to the mid-1800s talking about the only way to kill a Wendigo is by silver bullet.
Oh, wow. That is really neat. Do you find often that these like older accounts in the papers in the 1800s, were they a lot more, I guess you could say, like free to report on these sort of things, or they took it more seriously?
Some did,
So,
others did not. Quite a bit, especially with the Wendigo. And I think even to today with Wendigo psychosis, a lot of the newspapers at that time scoffed at it. And obviously, they were blatantly racist back then.
mm,
And they looked down at the Native people and the First Nation people. And they believed it was some sort of foolish superstition by these primitive peoples. And much to do to today with Wendigo psychosis, I think it's the same thing, that it's hard for us 400 plus years, maybe longer, looking back to try to get into the mindset of the people living of that time and their belief system. Keep in mind, many of the belief systems, there was no difference between the dream state and the waking state. So if a Wendigo came to you in your dream and offered you food, and if you ate it in your dream, you were going to turn into a Wendigo. And people were terrified if they had a dream of the Wendigo because the dream state was no different from the waking state. So it's really impossible for us today to look back and truly get into the mindset. And a lot of the newspapers just covered it in general terms. They would talk about the Wendigo, and when they explained it to their readers, they would say a giant cannibalistic monster that everyone feared and that was impervious to weapons, but they'd never get into the details of it. What did it look like? Did it talk? They often talked about the voice of it being able to paralyze people with fear, but they never got into the specifics of the color of the skin, the smell of it. It was always just in general terms. And I really wish there was some researcher back in the 1800s that would have just sat down and just head to toe filed this down so we would have it. But I think that's part of the fun as well, is trying to piece this puzzle together.
yeah, no kidding. Something I've noticed too, I'm currently researching the miraculous airship wave of 1896 and 97. And what I've noticed is you have a lot of, actual reporting being done on the topic and people who are very serious about it throughout the papers. And then, typically a rival paper or another town would come back with almost a rebuttal hoax and ridicule this scenario. And I know that was happening in Van Meter too, which of course you and Backroads Lore Crew researched extensively and brought that legend to light. Do you find that with the Wendigo, when you have one genuine report of it in these papers, is there another town, like the next town over, ridiculing it, or did they kind of tend to leave it alone?
No, it was the same thing with the legends of the airships that you were talking about, where one city may have a sighting and then a city over would say, what are they drinking in Stillwater that makes them see airships?
Yeah.
And that was the same with the Wendigo, but it was covered in national papers all over. And they would take a story and they would reprint it verbatim, but then they would have some commentary on it of, are these people crazy? Or listen to the primitive beliefs here, that type of thing, where they wouldn't do any investigation on their own. They would just dismiss it out of hand.
Man, seems like we haven't come very far then. So, how exactly did you become involved with the paranormal in general? I know that you started kind of from a psychological aspect, looking at the beliefs in the paranormal. And I'm really interested in hearing about that because it's very Fox Mulderish, actually, like going from a background in psychology to this field.
Well, I blame my interest in the paranormal on my home state of Wisconsin, because not only, as you know, do we have the UFO capital of the world here, but we have three of them. Three towns in Wisconsin claim all to be the UFO capital of the entire world. And I grew up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and I was not too far from Elmwood, one of those capitals. And in high school, I was interested in why people were seeing UFOs in Elmwood. So I drove there and started interviewing people who had believed they had spotted something they couldn't explain. And then I happened to start studying psychology at college. And that's what I was really interested in, is what makes some people believe in this stuff, ghosts, crop circles, UFOs, and others, they completely do not. What was it about human perception or maybe our belief systems? So I started researching that. And I started presenting my research, which was really boring statistical stuff. It was at research symposiums. And even though it was terribly done, people in the audience would come up and say, I need help. I think my home's haunted, or I saw some creature in the woods I can't explain. Could you help me investigate? So I really started shifting then into grad school of not only looking at the cause of the beliefs, but what people were actually experiencing. And that's when I started going out to these places and trying to gather research and dig up folklore on my own.
That is really cool. It reminds me a lot of Messengers of Deception by Jacques Vallée, which is even more than a study on UFOs. It's a study on the belief in UFOs and the belief systems around them. And that's incredibly interesting to me because as a fan of Keel, I also wonder about how preconceived notion and perception might change what people are seeing with this. Have you noted any like patterns between if someone does have a preconceived belief about something, does that change what they see, or is it kind of more of an objective phenomenon? Or I guess
Well,
it probably could vary.
yeah, I ended up doing my master's thesis on students' belief in the paranormal. And some of the interesting things I found were one, that if somebody obviously had a sighting of something, they were more likely to believe in the possibility that that thing was real. And that makes a lot of sense. If you see a ghost in your bedroom, you're going to be more likely to believe that ghosts could possibly be real. But even more interesting, what I discovered is that it didn't take a personal experience. It could be an experience of a trusted friend or relative that could influence you. So if grandma had a UFO sighting and talked about it all the time, you'd be much more likely to believe in the possibility of UFOs being real than somebody who did not have a close relative or friend that had a sighting. But I also looked at um, religiosity and how religious a person was. And that seemed to affect certain portions of the paranormal in terms of angels and demons and ghosts. That if you're very religious and you see something in your room, you're more likely to believe it might be an angel or a demon rather than this a ghost or an alien. So that played into as well. But I was really amazed when I started discovering gender differences in beliefs, where statistically speaking, I found that female gender were more likely to believe in what I consider internal things, ESP, telepathy, out of body experiences, where the men in the study were much more likely to believe in the possibility of things that I think are external, things you could hunt and kill, vampires, sea serpents, werewolves, and the like. So I found that was an interesting contrast too.
That is super interesting. Um, I do have a question. If someone say believed or I guess had a personal experience or knew of someone with a personal experience with something in one field of the paranormal, like a ghost or something, did that make them likelier to believe in another field, such as Bigfoot or UFOs, or did it kind of remain confined to that one genre?
No, it was across the board that it seemed to open their mind up. And what I was amazed to find also is that doing the research for the intro to the thesis is that other researchers across the board have found that the more educated somebody is, the more likely they are to believe in the possibility of these things. And that makes sense because when you go to college, I think, or you're exposed to a lot of different ideas, whether you believe in them or not. And I found it fascinating because the people were, the way the studies were conducted, it was the possibility of it. Not saying you believe in aliens, but do you believe there's a possibility? And the more education, formal education somebody has, the more likely they are to believe in that possibility, which I was a little surprised by that when I found it out too,
Yeah, it's definitely not necessarily portrayed that way in pop culture, I guess.
especially in the UFO field.
Oh gosh, no kidding. Yeah, and that's a very good distinction too, the possibility of versus an actual personal belief in the phenomenon. It's a very strong dividing point too. Do you find that the UFO field gets a little bit more ridiculed than other fields, or is it again kind of across the board? Because I know you've been involved in everything: UFOs, ghosts, cryptids, the whole nine yards, pretty much.
When I started out, I was most interested in UFOs. And over the years and the decades, that has shifted a little bit. But I think UFOs traditionally have been the sideshow of the paranormal, that most people could believe spirits are out there and maybe there's this undiscovered animal that we haven't found yet or one that we thought was extinct but is still here. But the idea of intelligent something coming from somewhere or some time or some place seemed a little far fetched to most people. But I think that is changing. And I think the media is responsible for a lot of that, of all the UFO shows that are on every station out there. I think has put it out there where most people are a lot more comfortable. At least I see at my presentations and lectures that 20 years ago, people were very hesitant to raise their hand and say, I saw a UFO. Now, sometimes when I present, somebody will say, I believe I've been abducted. Does anyone else here believe that as well, that they've been abducted? And oftentimes, a couple hands will go up. So people are a lot more forthcoming or comfortable now than they were 20 years ago.
Yeah, I definitely see that as well. Do you think, I know some people, and this is kind of a far out question, a lot of people I've seen think that the media's kind of general acceptance of the UFOs, has grown over the years because the American public in particular is kind of trying to be prepared for disclosure, that the government has, kept knowledge of UFOs and aliens and stuff like that secret for many years, and they're like trying to move towards disclosure, and that all of these movies and TV shows are trying to get people ready for that. I'm not sure what I think about that theory, but I was wondering what you think about it.
If they are, and again, this is all speculation.
Oh, yeah.
After all these years, I'm left with more questions than answers. But I think these are fun thought experiments, at least, because if they're doing it very slowly, I think. Maybe they're ramping it up now, but I think they're doing it slowly because of things that have happened that maybe cause some hesitation. And remember how many people freaked out about Y2K?
Yeah.
I mean, people were building bunkers, stocking up on hundreds of years of food just because of a computer glitch. And now imagine if they believe that or are told that there's some other intelligent force coming here. I don't know if people could handle it. I guess there's one way to find out. But if they are slowly putting this stuff out to get people used to the idea, I think they could pick up the pace a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Too, another common misconception that I see a lot is that a lot of people think that UFOs are a new phenomenon. They're kind of came to be in the last century. And of course, I know you're very interested kind of in the older predecessor to the UFO phenomenon and the connections there with like fairy lore and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think most people, if they look back into history, some of the most fascinating UFO accounts, that's where they rest. That today, a lot of UFO reports for me can get very tedious in the research because it's a strange light in the sky. Someone sees it for a few seconds, it's gone. There's not a lot you can do with that, but a lot of the older accounts not only were of ships and crafts, but of occupants as well. And those are fascinating when people talk about these occupants on board or around these craft and sometimes interacting with them. That I think this phenomena, when you look at fairy lore and being fairy led by these creatures, it may date back a lot longer than we originally thought. Most people, when they think of UFOs, think of, 1950s type era and beyond, where they seem to go back hundreds of years.
Yeah, that's very true. Another thing that I find really interesting, because of course I was a field investigator with MUFON for some time, and what kind of hit me going through these investigations is, you'd get a report, and no matter how amazing the experience was, actually going and trying to, find the thing was downright impossible because it's kind of like trying to find, where lightning is going to strike next. But with fairy lore, it seems like there were certain places or landmarks that these things would kind of constantly reappear. You could constantly encounter the fairies, places that people would avoid. What do you think about that difference kind of between, if this is all potentially one phenomenon, why it seems like they're more just at random now?
That's one of the drawbacks that I found in UFO research is that the majority of the cases I was called to were past tense, that they had already happened. So you're going there to interview the witness, get a view of what they saw and where they saw it, but it was very unlikely that it was going to happen while you were there. Whereas with hauntings or cryptids, there's a possibility that it's still lurking or still is going to happen. But the randomness, yeah, seems to be where in the old days, there were spots that you would avoid or gather at because of its paranormal reputation. And that often was brought into the naming of the places. So they would be called Spirit Island or Devil's Gulch, places that were thought to have these paranormal properties to them. Where today that doesn't seem to be as popular. And maybe it's just the shifting culture and society where everything seems to look the same no matter what city you're in. It's the same hotels, same businesses, same restaurants. And I think people are also looking and craving for that uniqueness, which is why so many paranormal festivals are so popular, where these towns are celebrating their unique legends and lore. Even if they don't believe in them, people want something different that they can't get in every other city.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. I always wondered too, because again, big fan of John Keel and his theories on this. And of course, he kind of propounded this idea that most or all paranormal phenomena might be due to some sort of super spectrum and, different energies. And I've always wondered too if kind of this almost dispersal instead of having these areas. I mean, there are still areas of high strangeness, no doubt about that. But instead of having these very, very concentrated, like stay away from this particular place, if that dispersal might be due to, the electronic age, which we're very much a part of.
I think that certainly could be a possibility. And what I'm finding, and it goes back all the way to the early days of research, is that often when you hear of something happening, a UFO or a monster or what be it, when you start digging, you'll find that people have other experiences there as well. Last time I was at Loch Ness looking for the Loch Ness monster, I ended up talking with more locals about their UFO sightings than monster sightings. And that really illustrates that these places may be paranormal beacons or paranormal hotspots where not only do you have sea serpent reports, you have UFOs, you have hauntings, and all kinds of weird things that are gathering. And maybe that, again, has been dispersed by our electronics. I don't know.
Yeah, I know it is all kind of far out speculation, but it's interesting too because, with the advent of digital cameras, the skeptic community is always saying, well, okay, everyone has a camera now, or especially now phone cameras. Why aren't we getting more pictures of these things? And I always wonder too if it's the nature of digital as opposed to analog that somehow either malfunctions or almost keeps this stuff at bay because, so many times it seems like someone has a report and they're like, either they had their camera and they just didn't even think to pick it up, or the camera malfunctioned, or the sighting so happened when they didn't have their phone on them. Is that a pattern kind of that you've seen?
Yes, obviously skeptics say now that we have cameras everywhere, people have cameras on their doorbells now.
Yeah.
Why aren't we not catching more phenomena? And I think on one end we are. Like when we used to use 35 millimeter film, rarely would we catch a lot of orbs. They still occurred, but not to the frequency they do today, where with digital cameras, orbs, which if your listeners are not familiar, and which you're very studied in, the little round balls of light that seem to appear in photos. I wasn't getting as many of those on 35 millimeter film as when I switched to digital. But I think the problem with the skeptics saying everyone has a camera on their phone now is that you're right that when people experience some of these things, oftentimes it's not 20 minutes of experience. It's often a few seconds. And when they're watching it, it doesn't even dawn on them to grab their phone and get to their camera and take a photo. They're just trying to figure out what's going on. And also back in the day, we used to have just point and shoot cameras where you'd grab it, point and shoot. Where now a lot of people have to grab their phone, unlock it, get to their camera, and then snap a photo where the phenomena might be gone by then. So I think that's one of the drawbacks of modern technology as well.
I know too. I've seen so many people in relation to this particular argument say, they'll see a deer cross the road or a bear or something, and it doesn't even occur to them to snap a picture then, just because, it doesn't happen so fast and you're intrigued by what you're seeing. So to imagine seeing, a UFO or Bigfoot or something like that, my first thought, unfortunately, probably wouldn't be to grab my camera. And I would like to remind everyone that you are listening to Just Another Tinfoil Hat, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Zelia Edgar, and we are visiting with Chad Lewis.
And I've tried to practice that over the years, that when I'm driving or pull over somewhere or something happens where it's just mundane stuff, not paranormal, that I try to grab my camera and snap a photo. So if something were to happen, I'd be prepared. But also there's some, I think, paranormal aspect to not capturing things too, that the history and literature of paranormal is filled with accounts of people setting down their camera to get a drink of water and a sea serpent pops up, or that they're changing out batteries and something happens, that almost as though it's timed, or there's bad luck, or it's purposefully shading itself from us capturing it. And there's so many of those accounts that it's hard to believe they're all coincidental.
Yeah, well, I know too, moving kind of further into that topic, I mean, you even see people who just, that when they have a paranormal occurrence, and one of the top kind of things where I see this happening is with the Men in Black, and they say, well, I don't know why, I did this, I don't know why I let them in the house and stuff like that. Almost as if there is some element of control, over the witness in that situation. Do you think that there might be some sort of ability on the part of the paranormal to slightly alter a person's actions when they're viewing it?
I think so. Not only with the men and women in black that seem to have this uncanny ability to force people to allow them in or go along with what normally you would never do, but also with, if you look at abduction legends and lore, of having the ability to shut people off or to control them or to almost put them in a frozen type state where you can do pretty much what you want. That I think there has to be some sort of ability of the paranormal, not only to disguise itself, but maybe it's impossible to even document it. In my experience, I'm running all kinds of things. When I'm driving, I have a camera, a dashboard camera going the entire time. So if something were to jump out, usually animals, known animals, it's already documented. I don't have to try to find my camera, and I can just observe it and know that it's being recorded. But I think there's a possibility that it might never capture anything supernatural or paranormal by design.
I know there is this really bizarre balance between almost what the phenomena wants us to see and what it doesn't want us to see, but most definitely there is kind of an impossibility in documenting most of it. Even the contradictions that arise in reports. I'm very interested right now too in kind of the artifact game, which of course Keel kind of brought up in Operation Trojan Horse, how many artifacts and items given to people in paranormal situations, whether it's UFOs, ghosts, you name it, they turn out to be very mundane things, such as one of my favorite encounters, which you have in your UFO presentation, the case of Joe Simonton and his famous alien pancakes.
Yeah, they seem to be, by all accounts, regular pancakes you could make in your kitchen. But they were handed to him by, as you know, what seemed to be something not of this existence or this planet or this time or this realm, whatever you believe. So why would they be working with ingredients that were just found on Earth? It makes zero sense. And as you mentioned with Keel, he felt maybe much of that was on purpose, that it was just a distraction or more confusing and puzzling aspects that would lead you down a dead end of research, but it would throw you off the scent.
Yeah, and that comes up just time and time again, even just, I know there's a lot of cases with ghosts. A really interesting one is Summerwind, how there was this kind of ongoing hunt for this mysterious land deed. And it's almost like there's so much information given and so much of it contradicts itself that it kind of leads you in circles. Do you think this is something that's possible to unravel, or something that just will kind of forever be on the horizon, so to speak?
Years ago, I really switched my train of thought and my belief and my adventuring from looking to solve a lot of these issues that we're speaking of to the idea of the adventure and the folklore aspect of collecting, gathering, analyzing these things, and that if nothing ever happens, I'll be fine. So many people that started out researching when I did, and they got into it believing they're going to solve this case or prove what UFOs are, et cetera, they burned out a long time ago because the overwhelming majority of time you're at these places, nothing out of the ordinary happens. So I think you can get burned out very quickly. So early on, I made that shift to seeing this as more of an adventure, a fun road trip, hitting the back roads, digging up folklore, seeing stories for what they are, stories and legends, and being interested and puzzled and baffled by all that. Where I think by the time I'm done with this, whenever that may be, I'll probably be no closer to the truth than when I started. And for a lot of people, that's a complete failure. But for me, I'm leaning more toward the idea that maybe these things aren't meant to be solved, or maybe they'll never be solved. But then I'm hoping some young researcher like yourself proves me wrong and figures it out tomorrow.
Oh boy, that would be totally awesome. That's a very good point, though, too, because I know a lot of people, when they experience something that they can't explain, their first thought is, everyone's going to think I'm crazy. No one's going to believe me. And so I think that even just by documenting, so many people experience things outside of the normal. And it's kind of definitely a comfort to people who have experienced something and are legitimate and not, making up stories. And so that in and of itself, the study of it is worthwhile, even if no proof arises.
And I think we're seeing more and more, at least I hope so, that in days of gone by, people seem to specialize in some form of the paranormal. And today, obviously, most groups that call themselves paranormal researchers are just ghost researchers, hauntings. But I think more and more people are at least looking at the possibility that all these things are interconnected somehow, that why just research ghosts when you can bring in Bigfoot creatures or sea serpents or UFOs or crop circles or out of body experiences? That I've always taken the view of all of it's fascinating to me. Maybe it's connected, maybe it's not, but I never could just get into one topic on its own. And I found over my 25 years of doing this is I've shifted quite a bit in my interest from starting out with UFOs and moving on and then coming back and then shifting more like a river, twisting and turning down as it goes. That oftentimes may be a year or two where I'm really interested in one topic and then you shift back to something else.
Yeah, and I feel like too having those multiple interests, it does shed light on the other fields because it's true, so many people do still look at them very separately. And of course, I tend to think that there are definite connections, if not, it's all part of the same deal. And there's just so many similarities between these different fields that to have a knowledge of one definitely helps with the other, in my opinion.
I do too. I think if you're looking at, as we mentioned before, if you're looking at UFO research and you're just into UFOs, you're going to miss a lot of the fairy connections that seem to be very similar to UFO research. And the same thing with hauntings and cryptids, that if you're looking at one, you may miss out on other legends. And as I mentioned before, that oftentimes I'll be at a place talking about a haunting and someone will say, oh, I've never heard of this bridge being haunted, but did you know there's said to be a gnome living under it? Those type of things where if you're just focused on one thing, you might be missing out entirely on a whole other topic. And people view these things differently as well. That, for instance, there's a place down in Illinois called Cambridge, Illinois, and it's a place called Death Curve. And a lot of people know of it because there's said to be a woman carrying an axe haunting the place. But more people know about it because of the natural history of Mrs. Markham actually murdering her 7 children with an axe, and they see it more as a historical case. So if you approach it as history, many more people know about it than have you heard of the ghost out at this place? They'll say, no, never heard of it, but they have heard of the story of the origin of it.
Do you find too that some people, when they're going for one aspect of a place, end up with a completely different one? Like, say, they go looking for a ghost and they end up seeing a UFO, or they go looking just for the history and they see a ghost. Does that happen a lot?
I think it does. And I think the good researchers will be open to that and document it. Others may brush it off. Especially, I've noticed a lot of people in the UFO field, that's their main interest. They don't care about anything else, just UFOs. And I think if you approach it from that, you're missing out on a lot of other areas that you could find yourself going down and bringing up a lot of fruitful cases that it may not seem like this is attached at first glance, but when you start digging deep, you'll see there's a lot of similarities. So I think a lot of researchers are doing themselves a disservice by having too narrow of a focus.
Oh, yeah, I definitely agree with that. I've been interested in this since I was a kid. And when I started out, I was very much like, okay, UFOs are from space and cryptids are undiscovered creatures and ghosts are, just spirits of the deceased and stuff like that. And it was then hitting, John Keel's research and starting to see these similarities and patterns that really just opened up my eyes to being like, okay, there's more going on here. Something too that's really intriguing to me, and Ivan Sanderson actually, I think, is one of the first researchers that pointed this out, was the connection of poltergeist activity to UFO sightings. That someone would see a UFO and then start having poltergeist activity in the house. And of course, poltergeists have usually been just associated with kind of more ESP or telekinesis. And that's kind of, I feel like moving away from that. Is there kind of something that I've just been wondering, because a lot of my research, I like, kind of the 60s, 70s era of all this when parapsychology was really big. Is that kind of waning in interest, you would say, or is it kind of experiencing kind of rebirth? Because I feel like for a while it was definitely not at the forefront anymore.
It certainly had a decline, definitely, where back in the 70s and even early 80s, you could go and get a degree in parapsychology. And maybe you still can in some Western state, in some school in California, but that was a course of study that you could actually embark on. And most people were interested in that. And they were doing laboratory studies where I think during the 90s and early 2000s, that's really been on a decline. But I do see a shift upwards in people interested in that. And maybe it's all the psychic shows on television as well that people, that leads them a little gateway into the more scientific work that's going on. But I definitely see an uptick in interest in people wanting to study in a more scientific way, a lot of ESP and telekinesis and the like. So I think hopefully that's rebounding.
Yeah. Do you see like a connection between all that sort of phenomenon and outside paranormal phenomena? Kind of similar to how you're talking earlier about how more women tended to believe in these kind of internal paranormal things, whereas men tended to believe in external paranormal things. Do you think there may be a connection between such things as ESP and telepathy and stuff like that and seeing, say, a cryptid or a UFO or a ghost?
I certainly do. A lot of people who believe they're psychics or intuitives, that they have the ability to sense things, whether it's hauntings or people believe they can sense when UFOs are going to be appearing and the like. I think they also find that believe they have other abilities or skills, whether it's ESP or telepathy and the like, that I think they have to be connected in some way. Maybe we'll never know, or maybe we will, but it seems that the idea that they wouldn't be is far more interesting to me than they are, because I have to think they are.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely seem to go hand in hand. So it's just interesting to me because it seems like the paranormal field and all the external sightings have gained a lot of popularity, whereas the internal ones have sort of dropped off. But hopefully they are kind of experiencing, renewed interest in that.
Well, I think a lot of the time, the external things are a lot easier to get into. That you can easily go to any haunted place in your own hometown and check it out, dig up research. dig up the history, the background, the folklore, the legend of the place. But it's much harder to get into a laboratory and start setting up experiments and actually looking into it. So I think there's a little bit of something prohibiting people from easily getting into it. And for a lot of people, the small little roadblock is enough for them to stay away.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Well, and speaking of haunted locations or, weird locations, I know too your Supernatural Dares YouTube page is pretty much a road guide to these different places and different dares that you can go through there. And I have a question about that because I don't know quite exactly how many videos you have, but you've been to so many of these locations and done so many of these dares. Is there anything that you would be too far, like, anything that would be just too creepy that you wouldn't do, such as I've always thought like retracing, going through the Bermuda Triangle is something that I would actually hesitate about. Is there anything like that where you might draw the line?
Well, I wouldn't draw the line in terms of this is too scary or this is too creepy. And that certainly doesn't mean I'm not scared because, as you know, I always state that if you're going to these places and you're not getting scared, you're not trying hard enough because these places are downright creepy, bizarre, and just puzzling. But I don't know if that would prohibit me from doing them. I think the only ones that I've not done is that some of them that I felt were too disrespectful. And those usually involve cemeteries where you have to do something with the grave. You have to sit on it or do something where I thought might be pushing the boundaries of where I'm comfortable with. But in terms of doing it because it's dangerous paranormally, no, nothing bothers me. Now, doing it because it's a stupid idea physically where you might die, I think a lot of people have to judge that for themselves, that people are falling off cliffs taking selfies now.
Yeah.
So I think any legend tripper has to determine whether it's worth risking death for this one legend when you're going to be missing out on a lot more legends. Some legends you just have to skip because circumstances just don't pan out for you to do them, or it is too dangerous and it's just not worth it because, as you see from my videos, most of the time when I'm at these places, nothing happens when I'm actually there filming, which makes a lot of sense because it's such a narrow little band of time that the odds of something happening while we were rolling the camera, doesn't seem very likely. But I think each legend tripper has to figure out how they like doing it. And how they like researching. Many people love researching and never going to the places. And others don't like digging up so much history. They just like going there and legend tripping. So people often ask me when they want to get involved with ghost research mainly, should they join a group or how do they go about starting? And I always tell them you have to find the way you like doing it. Some people want to be very scientific about it. Others want to bring in new age stuff, use Ouija boards, and bring in a lot of psychics or intuitives. So I don't think there's any right or wrong way to do this research, especially if you're just doing it for fun.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting too regarding the actual physical dangers. I feel like when people are researching this stuff, they do sometimes forget that they're, aside from any potential paranormal danger, there is actual real physical danger to, some of these places. I know there's a few. That one Goatman Bridge has had several deaths in the past couple of years from people either falling off or I believe there's a train that runs through. And then that kind of creates a legend of its own of this cursed location due to so many deaths. Are there many places like that you've come across, or is it kind of few and far between?
There are a lot that have natural deaths that occur at them, and then maybe others that are tied to the legend. Goatman Bridge, as you said, is one where people either fall off or, as you said, trains coming and they have no option but to jump to their death. But I've done dares at, for instance, in Mary Dean, Wisconsin, a small little uninhabited island that a town used to live on. You have to get out to the island by crossing the river. And many people every year drown at that very spot in the river. whether it's tied to the ghost of this woman named Mary Dean that haunts the island or not, I don't know. But people are losing their lives there in drowning. And I think it's very fascinating because when I've talked to their friends and family, they said that that person was drawn there for some unknown reason, almost as though they had a compulsion to get there. And then when they got there, it ended up taking their lives. So a lot of these places that are surrounded in paranormal legends also have deaths that occur that may or may not be related.
That's very interesting too. It's a bizarre point kind of also to wonder where the influence starts and ends with these places, because a lot of people think that just you go to the place that potentially is haunted or has weird occurrences and you might experience something there. But I know a lot of other people believe that that influence can extend definitely after the event, but possibly before too.
And you're right, it brings in a whole nother realm of weirdness that when people start hearing of young people dying at this road, it only attracts more and more people, which in turn is going to cause more and more deaths, which in turn draws more and more people. So I think what I'm fascinated by with the paranormal is also the marketing of it. And this ties into the idea of more and more people going there and more people dying, is that some legends that may not have a lot of information behind them or a lot of great research, they have a lot of great marketing behind them. So they become very well known. And people often flock to these places because they're well known. Whereas you might have much better luck at a different location that not many people know about, but you might have more of a paranormal experience there. So it's like anything, that the publicity behind some of these places is what seems to propel them rather than their oddities.
I know sometimes I wonder too, an event happens and then you have dozens and dozens of people rushing to go see it. I know that happened with the Mothman. Immediately the sightings started, then you had all of these, amateur saucer hunters or, self-proclaimed monster hunters rushing to the area. And it seems like for the most part, things tend not to occur in front of the large crowd. It's always, a couple blocks down the road.
And that's another thing of the trickery of it, or maybe the confusion of it, that you're right. When these things happen, monster hunters descend or ghost researchers, and nothing really seems to happen while the big crowd's there. But then a few miles away, when someone's not actively looking for it, they're just going about their business, that seems to pop up there, almost as a whack-a-mole type game where you can never follow it. And that's why so many people go to these places when it happens, but yet your odds of seeing it after it happened, you might be better going to just the side or the outside, just on the edges of where these things happen. You may have a better chance.
Yeah, and that just brings us right back to the whole camera deal. It's kind of like somehow the perception of the event and the event itself seem to be tied in ways that I definitely don't understand.
Well, back when we used to take photos a lot at hauntings, if a psychic told me that there was some spirit in front of them, or they got a sense that there was something in front, we should take a picture. I would always take a picture right where they spotted it and then directly turn around 180 degrees and take another photo right behind me to see if there'd be any difference or something out of the ordinary there, as though they were picking up on something, but maybe just by chance they caught something. So I would always throw in that 180-degree turn just to cover all bases.
Did you find that one of the pictures would usually have something anomalous on it over the other one?
Yeah, I was finding, well, it depended too on the psychics I was using, that oftentimes I found many of the psychics I would use or bring with, they would often tell me things that would be very difficult for them to have known prior to them being there. Often they didn't know where we were going, what case we were researching. So the odds of them knowing something specific about this obscure place was very low. But also, on the other hand, I've had times where I felt you'd be better off asking a piece of toast for information because the psychics were telling information that was completely off of what I was looking for. And again, maybe it wasn't wrong. Maybe they were picking up on something else in the area that I didn't know about, but they weren't picking up on the exact thing I was looking for. So I've had mixed results with psychics, and the same with photos, that sometimes you would find there'd be these orbs or mist or balls of light in the photo where they directed you, but behind you, nothing out of the ordinary.
I've always wondered. I've only had personal experience with a Ouija board, a grand total of one time, and it was very interesting. And it was exactly kind of what I thought it would be like. It almost seems like radio frequencies kind of constantly changing because, you get something that's strung together with one other thing, and then it would be mixed in with a bunch of stuff that was just totally random. Do you feel like that's kind of with the psychics you've worked with? Do you feel like it's kind of like that some of them just can tune into information better than others, or there are places that are easier to tune into?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that some psychics have an ability to fine tune and go to one radio station, if you will, where others are picking up just on scattershot everywhere. But also, that seems to happen too with people using ghost boxes
Mhm.
and other electronical devices that they bring in for hauntings, that oftentimes they'll hear all the answers that fit their questions, but they'll skip over the 90% that just is gibberish or not communicating anything. And I think because so much of this is speculation, that I think people rush to these devices of EMF meters and recordings for EVPs, that they think of it as evidence of the unknown. And I've always joked that, when did electronic phenomena or electricity of your EMF meter, when did that ever get attached to ghosts? Why isn't it evidence of unicorns?
No, that's
There's
yeah.
people walk around with these machines and they beep and say, oh, that's a ghost, but they have no evidence to tie it into a ghost, rather than why isn't it a fairy or a sea serpent or a devil or demonic spirit? So I think people often rely too much on equipment in terms of their research, that they neglect some of the real research that can be done of the history, the background, the folklore, and they get tied up on these electrical bleeps and spikes in their EMF meters.
Yeah, that I completely agree with that. I know I kind of, in reading Keel and, being introduced to that sort of idea, I did really lose, I guess you could say, lose faith in the very conventional ways of looking at this phenomenon. And that is the interesting thing, is you have many of these haunted locations, which, as we mentioned earlier, they're also the locations of other sorts of disturbances. How can you definitively state that, information you're receiving is from a ghost as opposed to whatever these other anomalies might be?
And it goes back to the idea of your beliefs factoring into what you experience or your perception, that many people at my UFO presentations will come up to me and say, now, you do realize that people who are seeing aliens or believe they're being abducted are really being abducted by demons,
Mm.
that they're posing as aliens. So I think our perception really carries a lot into what we believe and what we experience.
Can that also have an effect on? I know people tend to have very strong responses, either positive or negative, to any sort of unexplainable phenomenon. Can the belief really kind of color something as to whether it's positive or negative?
Certainly. I think many people, and a lot of my UFO, when I do a UFO program, a lot of the abduction stuff that I talk about is negative, that a lot of the experiencers and abductees tell me that it was something that they didn't want. It has ruined their life, disrupted their families and their marriages, all kinds of mishap and misfortune. But every once in a while, someone will come up to me and say, actually, this happened to me, and I thought it was a beautiful thing. I was healed, or my headaches went away, or all of a sudden I took a different path, and now I'm very concerned about the environment, or I'm into new age research. So I think when we say something in the paranormal field, we can never be 100% certain that it covers every aspect. There are always exclusions. There are always people that have the contrary experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in turn, I guess, too, I've always wondered because, again, from the research of like the 60s and 70s when contactees were all the rage, so many of them had these very, very positive experiences. And then you did have the abduction experiences coming forward around that time as well, which were the complete opposite end of the spectrum. And it is difficult, I feel, to really sort out kind of what the objective experience is when you have these very contradicting sort of scenarios.
Well, we mentioned the 70s quite a bit in this program. And just the other day, I was talking with my friend David Weatherly, who's going to be headlining the Van Meter Visitor Festival this year, which
Ooh,
you're
nice.
also speaking at, Zelia.
Oh,
And
awesome.
he and I were talking about if you could be alive at any point in time for the paranormal, the 70s, and researching it anyway, would have been the best time ever. Or monsters were everywhere, UFOs were exploding, hauntings were everywhere. There was something about the early and mid 1970s that seems to be something was going on because creatures and weirdness was everywhere.
It's hilarious because just a couple weeks ago when I was recording my episode with Steve Ward, who of course too you know from the Van Meter Visitor Festival as well, I just mentioned that too. That like seriously, the '70s, I kind of feel like I was born in the wrong time. So
Yeah,
that's hilarious.
and Steve was researching in the 70s, both the 1870s and 1970s.
And I
So
think the
he has
1770s.
yeah, he has a great interest, and that's the beauty of. There are some old timers, researchers, you know, Jerome Clark and Lauren Coleman and the late Brad Steiger, who were researching in the 1970s. They were part of that, and I'm always envious because it seems like they had so many cool cases to go check out.
Yeah, seriously, that's something that does bother me too, is why it seems like that era, and I do kind of feel like the Mothman in the '60s kind of kicked it off. It just had so much going on and so many different things as well. Like, do you have any possible reason as to why that time was just literally hopping with paranormal activity?
Well, there's a lot of theories on it, a lot of conspiracy theories that it was drug induced or government experiments. Others believe there were certain portals opening up and that was allowing us to experience these things. But not only were things happening, but a wide variety of them. You had creatures like sea monsters, but then you also had the big muddy monster, which was more Bigfoot looking. You had the Enfield horror that looked like this giant kangaroo hopping around. You had all these monsters that were very different, where today, one of the drawbacks is we seem to have certain categories for monsters. They have to be Bigfoot, werewolf, you know, ghost, other things, where back in the 70s and even prior to that, things were just way out of hand. They were just crazy. You had people seeing beer can aliens in Minnesota and all kinds of oddities. And I miss those days of these giant, you know, 12-armed creatures appearing out of nowhere.
Yeah, I do feel like it's almost like the phenomenon has streamlined. And this is kind of a sidestep, but I'm very interested in the issue of UFO occupant clothing. It was an article I recently wrote for Alternate Perceptions. And the interesting thing that I've noticed is that it seems like not only do you have appearances of these occupants that are just all across the board, but every now and again, you just get these trends. And for a while, it's like people are pretty much, most of them are reporting they were dressed in, scuba suits or something like that for a couple of years. And then all of a sudden, recently it's the grays. Those have been the big ones. And so I always wonder if part of this phenomena, it can sort of mold itself and it kind of works through these, I guess, trends, on how it's perceived, it becomes streamlined until that's kind of passe, I guess.
And we could do an entire show on clothing of weirdness and I think it's changing though, because even though it has been streamlined, every once in a while you'll get this outlier. For instance, there's a place down in Iowa called Terror Bridge, Tara, but the locals call it Terror Bridge because it's thought to be haunted since the 1800s. There's also stories of a giant werewolf type creature lurking in the area. And just recently, a woman contacted me and told me she had an encounter with a werewolf as they were driving, but she didn't want to mention it because it was too odd, because they were driving down the road when all of a sudden they saw a wolf-like creature running upright on its hind legs as fast as the car was going. But the thing she didn't want to share is that the creature was wearing some weird tweed jacket, like an overcoat, that a professor from the 1970s might wear. And it was running, it looked like a werewolf by all traditional standards, but yet it was wearing that overcoat that made it stand out. And again, it throws us back to, was that done because nobody would believe the story because of that weirdness aspect, or was it truly wearing that thing?
Yeah, I'm very interested in the phenomenon of the plaid shirt or the checkered shirt, which of course Keel pointed out way back when, that a lot of paranormal occurrences and entities are seen for some crazy reason wearing checkered shirts. And this goes beyond, things like, ghosts or phantoms or anything like that, to I've seen reports of, man-wolves or Bigfoot wearing checkered or plaid shirts. And it's just completely goofy.
It really is, and it's been going on a long time. I had a gentleman in his 60s tell me that when he was a young boy, him and his brother saw what they thought was this weird-looking man come into their room. And the thing that stood out is he was very tall and very thin, but what stood out to them is he was wearing this black and white checkered clothing or shirt that really stood out and was even hard to look at. Like, it didn't seem right, but there it was as that checkered pattern that so many other people have experienced. And again, this throws back to, is it something about our perception with our eye and our human mind that shifts these things to that pattern, or are they really that way?
Yeah, and there's always the question too of intent. Is the phenomenon aware of, how it's being perceived? And if so, is it capable of changing that? I mean, I feel like that is like the big question behind all of this is, people are experiencing things and the things appear to be aware of it, but what exactly do they mean by appearing at all?
I think that may account for some of the differences people have when they see the same thing, whether it's a UFO or a monster or a ghost. When groups of people see what seems to be the same thing, they'll have different versions of it, as though they're seeing completely different entities or different experiences. And that may be part of it, that it's projecting itself in different ways.
Yeah, that's one of the top theories for me, because there are so many things. I mean, and two, you bring up a good point. You have credible people who, in multiple witness scenarios, it seems like they really saw something, and then they're presenting different facts. It's almost like, is this an attempt to discredit them, or is it completely accidental? It's a very good question.
And I think a lot of people in the general public, they might take a sighting of a werewolf and maybe give it some credibility. But then you throw on that it had this weird tweed jacket, and all of a sudden, that person's crazy. Yeah. So, I wish I knew the origin as to why. Is it to mask and to hide, or is it to just throw people down, again, a dead-end road and throw them off track of where we should be researching?
Yeah, the tweed jacket, it just sounds like something kind of out of a B movie,
Yeah, it really does. And I think that's the intent of it.
Yeah.
The intent that the witness will never report it because people think they're weird. And if they do, nobody's going to take that seriously. I mean, who's going to take pancakes from an alien?
Yeah, exactly. But I suppose it looks like we are nearing the end of our conversation here. I know you always have so many book signings and presentations and things going on. So anything in particular coming up here that you'd like to talk about?
No, just go to the weirdest legend you can ever find. And most likely that's where you'll find me if you want to run into me.
Awesome. And thank you again so much. I can't say enough. You completely just have been such an inspiration and influence on my research. I literally have grown up going to your presentations, and I'm really grateful for that. So, thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for being on the show today.
Well, thank you. You are adding a voice much needed in this field, and I will see you at the Van Meter Visitor Festival.
Yes, I am so looking forward to that, and really excited about that one. So, that'll be awesome.
All right, keep an eye out, Zelia.
Once again, I would like to thank my guest, Chad Lewis, for a totally intriguing conversation tonight. I would also like to thank Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson, the people in charge here at the Paranormal UK Radio Network. And a thank you, too, to John Hutchinson for composing my intro and outro music. With all that said, if you enjoyed this program, you can catch new episodes every other Monday on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, as well as all of my older programs located in the Podbean archives. Also, go ahead and check out my YouTube channel, also called Just Another Tinfoil Hat. Again, this has been Just Another Tinfoil Hat, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and I am Zelia Edgar, signing off.